So join me please in welcoming Rankin.
Thank you, Rona, and thank you to the board and to Gordon. I really appreciate the hospitality that you've extended to my wife, Marie, and I. One of the, I need to begin by sharing with you a little bit of the turbulence of my emotions after this special day. Back in the fall, we were in Victoria at some meetings, and we were at the University of Victoria. We were at the City Hall, and we met with a variety of community groups. And one of the things that I experienced for the first time was this beginning, that speakers would begin by acknowledging the territory, the First Nation territory that they were in. So I was really captured by that as being an incredibly appropriate and respectful way to proceed. So for the first time in my life, I think we should do this home, Jennifer. I think we should. For the first time in my life, I would like to begin by acknowledging that, and I can barely handle the English language, so I'm really going to mispronounce this, by acknowledging that we are I am standing on Shuswap Nation territory. A number of delightful things have happened for me. One of those delightful things is to be here and for Jennifer to be here and us both speaking to the Cape Breton experience. One of the things that's quite special about home, about Cape Breton, is the substantial presence of a number of First Nation communities. And today there was that wonderful story about Member 2. From where I sit, Cape Breton has really had, as Rona mentioned, its struggles. And part of what happens when a community struggles for a long time is as Jane Jacobs said, the community loses its sense of possibility. One of the gift that Member 2 has given to that larger Cape Breton community is hope. It's a sign of hope. It's a sign of possibility. And the chief who spoke in the video, Terry Paul, as well as Dan Christmas, who was also in that video, are these iconic community figures, and as well have a stature, a statesman-like stature in the whole province. All in all, it is quite a gift we have. Terry was on the board of New Dawn years ago. This is before he was famous. He was on the board of New Dawn. Dan Christmas, more recently, was on the board, and now there's also an outstanding woman who, when she came on the board, was working with member 2, has since gone to work with the university with the Purdy Crawford chair, Mary Beth Doucette, who's on the New Dawn executive. And they have brought to New Dawn a wonderful depth of experience and understanding, and thus provided us with great advice. One of the delightful things about being here is that, well, it's lovely to meet new friends, but there's also all of these old friends that are here. You know that story? I feel a little bit like that guy in that story, and his friend was telling him, look, he was quite worried about things, and he said, look, the only thing to worry about is whether you're going to live or die. And if you're going to live, you've got nothing to worry about. But if you're going to die, you've got 2 things to worry about. Either you're going to go to hell, or you're going to go to heaven. If you go to heaven, you've got nothing to worry about. If you go to hell, you'll be so darn busy shaking hands, you won't have time to worry. That's what the other lovely part is that Linda Best is here from Nova Scotia, and I do not at all mean to diminish anybody else. It's just we're clannish, so we tend to reach for one another in occasions like this. I gotta tell you, to begin with, I gotta tell you, my goodness, British Columbia is beautiful. It is just so beautiful. When I go away and I come back, it's like I forgot just how beautiful it is. It's just remarkable. You remember that? It reminds me of this story. Remember the story about the guy and he was sort of decided he was going to travel all around the world. So off he went and he got to Europe and he was traveling around Europe. And in the course of visiting Europe, he comes upon this phone booth. And it's made of gold. And there's a sign on the phone booth, and it says, call eternity, talk to God, $10,000. Well, he's kind of struck with that. He's kind of intrigued with that possibility, but he wasn't prepared to spend $10,000 at that time. So then he went and he went to Asia. And he was touring around Asia, and my goodness, he came upon another one, gold phone booth. And sign on it. Call eternity, talk to God, $10,000. Kept touring around, he gets into the States, my goodness, he runs into another one. Gold phone booth, same thing. Call eternity, talk to God, $10,000. So you kind of take a note of that. And then he comes to Canada. I guess he came to British Columbia. And he's here, I guess he's here in the Okanagan region. He's traveling along and he sees another phone booth. Gold phone booth. Signs there again. Call eternity. Talk to God. 10 cents. So he's kind of struck with that. And he's looking at it, and he sees this old guy walking by. He says, look, I don't understand. I was in Europe and I saw one of those, it was $10,000. Then I was in Asia and I saw one of those, it was $10,000. Then I was in the United States and I saw one of those, it was $10,000. And I come here, it's 10 cents. The old guy says, "Oh yeah, but you gotta understand, it's a local call here." I have this, the other thing you should know, in terms of full disclosure, I have this special affinity for this region. This was the first, one of the first regions of the country I ever visited. So just kind of indulge me for a minute, and I'll tell you about that experience and its traumas for me, not being here, but getting here. I was young, I was in early university, and you know, I'd grown up on a farm, so most summers I worked in the woods or something like that. So we decided, my friend and I decided, we were going to go out into the world for the summer, and we were going to make big money. And for some reason, we associated British Columbia with big money. I hadn't even been to Halifax, eh? So we're going right by the mainland, we're going through Ontario, and we're coming right to BC with a big money, see? So I finished university around the end of April. I got some kind of a job, little job, and I saved $100, which was a fair bit of money at that time. I saved $100 to come to BC to get a really good job. We took a train. The little community I'm from and we live in now is Boysdale. We bought a train ticket from Boysdale to Vancouver, and the train ticket was $60. That's how much it was. We bought the train ticket, I had $40 left. You think of that. I mean, and not a worry in the world. It was all going to work out with $40. My mother, God bless her soul, my mother packed us a lunch. And the lunch was in this huge suitcase. It was the biggest piece of luggage we had. And we get on, so we get on the train. Now, when we were young, you know, you're young, the way you can eat, eh? You can just like eat. So we're about 15 minutes out of Boysdale, and we open the suitcase just to have a bite. It's 2 hours later, we're in Antigonish. Now, Antigonish is 2 hours, home of St. F.X. University, home of the Antigonish movement, of course, any of you that would know about that. We're going by Antigonish, and the suitcase is empty. We ate it all. The whole thing. $40, no food. On the train, in a seat, right? Now, the other thing you gotta understand about our innocence, about the world in general and the country in particular. We had no understanding of the size of Canada. Once we got past Montreal, we figured Vancouver is imminent. It's just around the corner. And then we get into Northern Ontario. Now, I don't know if you've traveled by rail or car through Northern Ontario. I mean, mothers should warn their children about Northern Ontario. It doesn't end, it's infinite. So Northern Ontario went on and on and on. We get to Winnipeg, and somebody told us, you're halfway there. We couldn't take it. We get off the train. At midnight, we had about $35 left. So we had never been in a big city before. But I don't know whether we read this or somebody told us when you're in a big city, the place to stay is the YMCA. You can get a really reasonable priced room. So it's midnight. Now, I didn't understand where we were at this moment, but at midnight on that night, we're standing on that iconic corner of Portage and Main. That's where we're standing, which meant nothing to me at the time. So we decided we needed to find the YMCA. So this poor dear woman is walking down the street, and we kind of waved her down, and she had the courage to stop, and we asked her where's the YMCA? And she said, oh, just down that street, past the bay. Just past the bay. So off we went. And we had no idea how to travel. We had these huge suitcases. I had everything I owned in the suitcase. So we're walking and walking. And every now and then we'd stop. See if we'd hear the bay. We'd walk some more. And we'd stop. And then we began to suspect that she had lied to us. But we were quite determined, and we wanted to believe in her, so we kept walking. I'm pretty sure about 3:30, I started to hear cows. I mean, I think we were that far out of the city. I think it was 5 years later before I figured out she was talking about the Hudson's Bay store. We didn't have any of those in Quebec. We never heard of the bay in Quebec. There was only one kind of bay. Anyway, so we toured Winnipeg without sleep. I remember to pass the time, we went to the provincial legislature, which happened to be in session, and I napped there in the visitors gallery. We got back on the train at midnight and made our way to Vancouver. Now you got just one more little piece here in terms of the history. In Boysdale, there was a canteen that we all hung out at, and the proprietor of that canteen had spent time in his earlier life in British Columbia. He'd come back relatively late. I'm there the night before we're leaving on the train, and we're kind of like celebrities. So like we're heading out, so everybody's wishing us well and full of envios. And the proprietor, Malcolm, called me aside. You know, he had been home now for 2 decades. He said to me, Rankin, sometimes when you go away, it doesn't work out like you think. If you get in trouble, if you're not making headway, get on a bus, go down to Penticton. When you get off the bus, walk down the street, see a drugstore, maybe go in there, ask them to call the Bumfords. You tell the Bumfords, you talk to them, you tell them I sent you. They'll take care of you. Now that just, as the guy from Inverness said, went out one ear and in the other. I mean, this was all going to work out. I was going to make big money. Might drive home in a sports car, you never know. Anyway, we get out to Vancouver, we stay with a couple of friends of ours. Now I think our plan, our unspoken plan, we were going to get work in construction. I'm not sure that was really a very good plan to begin with, but that summer, the construction industry was pretty well down, big strike. I'm not sure if it made any difference. Like we just had no idea how to get a job. Right? It was kind of a mystery to us. We took the whole thing quite literally. So we would go into a business and we'd fill out an application. And the apartment where we were staying, we'd write down the phone number. And then rather than keep looking, we'd run back to the apartment for fear that they would call. And we didn't want to miss the call. Anyway, so we didn't get work. Although $35 was a lot more money then than it is today, it still went pretty quick in downtown Vancouver. So money was getting scarce, and we were starting to kind of worry. And I guess that tape began to play. So I counted my money. I went down to the bus station. I had enough for a ticket to Penticton. And I just assumed this would all work out. I'd get on the bus, I'd drive to Penticton. I think it took all night to get there. It was a long drive. And I get off the bus, it seemed like the morning. Now Malcolm had been home for 2 decades, but it was probably 4 decades since he'd been in Penticton. He had no contact with the Bumfords for 40 years. But I didn't think about that. So I'm walking down and I see a drugstore. And he had said drugstore, so in I go. This is before Shoppers Drug Marts. These were kind of like nice, modest-sized drugstores. So in I go. This lovely woman behind the counter. I went up to her and I said, "Do you know the Bumfords?" She said, "Yes, I do."
Oh my God.
"They're my neighbors. They're my next door neighbors." I just figured, well, of course they are. I said, "I'd like to talk to them." She said, "Okay, I'll give them a call." She did. She passed me the phone. So I introduced myself with this female voice, and I said, "I'm Rankin MacSween, and Malcolm MacDonald told me if I was ever in Penticton to give you a call." She said, "I'll be there in 15 minutes.
Wow. She came and she picked me up, and they took me home, and they fed me, and put me up for the night. And in the morning, Mr. Bumford asked me if I'd like a job in the orchard, in a big orchard. And I worked in that orchard for a month, and I made enough money to buy a plane ticket. The first time I ever flew, I flew from Vancouver to Prince Rupert. And I got a job for the rest of the summer in Prince Rupert. I made enough money to buy a plane ticket to go home, to go back to university. I got home at $5 when I So, and this place to me is quite precious, quite special. So to return here it's not only just lovely to be with you, but it's a double honor in that way.
Have you called the Bumfords?
I said just as an aside, back a couple of years ago, we were going to Victoria again, Marie and I hadn't gone over the Rockies since that train ride. And so we rented a car in Calgary and we drove over the Rockies. And what I wanted to do was to see if I could find the house and see if even if one of the children were still living. And it took me, I couldn't believe it. It's all changed, it's a big subdivision, but you wouldn't believe it. It took us the best part of 2 days. I found the house. I found the farmhouse in among these huge new subdivision houses all around. I found the house. The orchard clearly is gone, but I knocked on the door. But anyway, one of the there was a book several years ago written by a psychiatrist. His name was Scott Peck, and it was kind of one of the first books that became popularized. One of the first books by a psychiatrist that became popularized. The first line in that book, the very first line, is "Life
is hard. And that book was on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks, and then months and months and months. Peck had an acquaintance, and her name was Elizabeth Lesser. And she wasn't close to him, but she had an incredible amount of respect for him. And she was so pleased that he wrote the book, and she was so pleased that the book did well. She lived in Manhattan. And every Sunday morning, she would have the New York Times delivered to their apartment. And first thing, she'd open the door, open up the New York Times to see if he was still #1. And she'd open it up, and she'd see that The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck was still #1. And she would call out to her husband, "It's still #1." And he would call back, "Life still must be hard." This is hard work you do. This is hard work. It's always been hard work. New Dawn started a long time ago. New Dawn started really early. New Dawn started early at a time where there wasn't a lot of language to describe what we were aspiring to do. And it was quite misunderstood. It was hard going, really hard going. I remember I was on the board at that time. I wasn't working for them, but I was on the board. And I remember we went to see this senior federal bureaucrat about some issue. And he, like most people, couldn't make much sense of us as an organization. And at some point, I forget what the detail was, but at some point, he became quite upset. And I remember he kind of rose up from behind his desk and he said, "Who do you people think you are? You don't know what you're doing. You're amateurs. And besides, who elected you? Who gave you this authority?" Now I remember thinking, good questions. But what he didn't understand, and what we weren't able to articulate at that time, is that really we were part of a movement, the early days of a movement, wherein communities are trying to take charge of themselves. That's what was going on. Now, Cape Breton is this fascinating place, and where New Dawn is, as we're remembered to it, is kind of down on the east end of the island. It is an island, that's where most of the population is. Just going back 100 years or so, it was industrialized, lots of coal, it was industrialized, and there was a steel plant built. And that was operated until 1966. The private company announced they were leaving, and the federal government moved in and took charge of the steel plant, and the coal mines, and the province took charge of the steel plant. And as well, the federal government really assumed responsibility for economic development for the whole island. Governments, senior levels of government may be very good at certain things. There's certain things that they perhaps aren't very good at. Maybe running industries is one of those things. In many ways, although this language was never used, it was a bit of a socialist experiment, I guess, in a response to a crisis, well-intentioned, but it really was an experiment, perhaps, that didn't go all that well. We are a community that is in severe decline,
And although we are not rural, we are not metropolitan either. We've been losing pretty well on average in a population of about 100, in the area we're in, the population is about 110, we've been losing about 1,000 people a year. We're the fastest declining municipal region in the country. We are number one. So there are many, many challenges. Nudon started, next year it'll be its 40th birthday, and Nudon's main claim to fame, surely I tell you, is we have survived. And a good friend of mine, who's dead now, used to say, survival is not to be underestimated. And we have survived. We are private, we're run by a voluntary board, and we do businesses. There's about 12 companies that have people in them, and there's 4 divisions. One has to do with housing, particularly affordable housing, some commercial as well, a fairly big footprint in the whole area of healthcare. We do training, and we have a whole social engagement, social development division as well. What I would like to do is just, and I want to take you into all of the, and we do the CEDA thing as well. We're very much involved in that. But maybe, and I don't want to take you into a lot of the detail, but maybe I always find the pictures quite helpful. So let me just we're going to run 3 very quick videos. 2 that speak to the training piece, they're back to back. They're a couple of minutes each. And then I'll share another little snippet with you about our social innovation, social engagement piece. This next one too is about training. This next one I want to show you, this was a couple of years ago. There had been this school convent in downtown Sydney. It had been run by a charity of the Sisters of Notre Dame. They'd been teachers They came into the community well over 100 years ago, and they had operated this girls' school. So this was you got to understand, I mean, we're an industrial community, and these sisters operating this girls' school, I mean, they had an incredible legacy in terms of providing the community with a whole array of opportunities and programs and services that I would be quite extraordinary for a community such as ours, and quite accessible in a time when women were overlooked in so many ways, and this congregation certainly hosted local women in an incredibly lovely way. So that school and convent closed. It was empty for a time, and we decided, after a lot of talking to the community, to go ahead and pick it up. And part of what we want to do is, in a different way, in a 21st century way, continue the legacy of that congregation. So that this one again is quite short. This is not moved on to these pieces. I hope that kind of give you a bit of a sense. But the other comment I want to make, to make a comment and build a bit on the presentation, the last presentation by Paul and Linda on the CF, which is an incredibly important program from New Dawn's perspective. First community development conference I ever organized. I was working at the university at the time, in the home, and the first one I brought in a guy, and his name was Rubinstein, and he was at the University of British Columbia. I lost track of him. I don't know what just did with him, but anyway, he just disappeared on me. One of the things he said that I never forgot at that conference was communities that are struggling, the ones that recover, there's three critical
three critical elements. The communities that have recovered are communities that have a particular sense of identity about themselves. They figure out who they are and what it is they want to be. Secondly, communities that have recovered have figured out the appropriate educational process. And he wasn't talking about education in the public school sense. There's three kinds of education. There's technical education, you learn to do something. There's conceptual education. What is truth? What is beauty? And then there's transformative education. And transformative education is the education of the heart. And through transformative education, you see things differently. Many people involved in this work, you end up with this very different understanding of your community, of your province, of your country, and of the world. This work, to do this work, means people have to always be understanding what happened, how did we get into this predicament, how do we get out, what's working, what's not working, where are we going. That's just a continuous, never-ending educational endeavor. Thirdly, no community has ever recovered that has not wrestled with the issue of how to raise its capital. Communities have to figure out how to raise their own capital, or there's no long-term recovery. Further to the figures that Linda was presenting, in Cape Breton, we buy 100 million in our RSPs every year. That's what we buy. Nothing stays on the island. Everything is shipped away. So in a figurative sense, we ship it to Toronto. That's what we do with it. And what do they do with it? They invest it, they create wealth, they create opportunity, they create jobs. And then what do? Then we send our children to work in those jobs. And then we say to one another, what's wrong? How come this is not working? A couple of years ago, when they closed the steel plant and they closed the coal mines, the federal and the provincial government put up $80 million as a community offset over 4 years. 80 million over 4 years. We had the equivalent of a royal commission of that. Who should get it? Who shouldn't get it? What it should be invested in, what it shouldn't be invested in, who should be doing the investing. It went on and on and on. Didn't turn out all that well. Probably at least half of it just got frittered away, unfortunately. Meanwhile, every year, we send away 100 million, and we don't even know. We're illiterate about it. Now, Cape Breton, my friends at the University College of Cape Breton tell me that in order to be normally poor, to be poor like the state of Maine is poor, to be that poor, wouldn't be prosperous. We would just be sort of normally poor. We've got a $2 billion economy on the island now, and we need to get that to 4. We need another $2 billion. Imagine that.
We normally poor.
We're just normally poor then. Who's going to write the check? But think of this. Think of this. We're sending away 100 million, and we say to people, we don't want it all. Send most of your RSP away. Just keep a little bit home. So every year, if we could keep 5 million of that home, if we could keep 10 million, 10% of that home, in 10 years, that's 100 million. We'd be creating a community equity fund of 100 million. You could take 100 million and you could leverage that like a good thing. You're on your way. It's possible. This can be done. This can be done.
We've raised close to 12 million, placed it all. We've paid $1 million in dividends. And it's been the best part for me, it has been this glorious educational process in terms of providing us with an opportunity to have a conversation in our community about what's wrong, the importance of capital, its transformative possibility. We've got 700. What's better than the money is the shareholders. We're not fundraising, we're friend-raising. We've got 700 shareholders growing. This year was the biggest year we've had in terms of the number of people that have signed on. Did you ever hear the story? Did you ever hear the story of the 100 monkeys? So there's this experiment that they did. There was this guy. He was a scientist, and what he wanted to do was he wanted to see if he could. There was this island of monkeys, and he wanted to see if he could teach them to wash potatoes. So the monkeys lived on potatoes, right? There was kind of these wild potato plants. So he went and he lived on the island. There's nothing but monkeys, no people, and him now. And what he would do, he would take a monkey down to the river, and he would show the monkey how, because the monkey, they're eating the potatoes just with the dirt on it. So he would take a monkey down and show him with, how to clean the potato. So the monkeys would pick it up really quickly, and from then on, that monkey, he'd get a potato, he'd go to the river, he'd wash it. So the guy kept doing this. He was there for weeks. Every day, he'd teach a new monkey. Some monkeys were slower, it would take more than a day. Some would take a week, but eventually they'd get it. And he kept thinking it wouldn't take that long. But he taught 10 monkeys, then he taught 20 monkeys, then he taught 50 monkeys, then he taught 60 monkeys, and the rest aren't catching on. 80 monkeys, 90 monkeys, 95 monkeys, nothing's happening. Except the 95 monkeys are washing potatoes, the rest aren't. He's getting quite discouraged. He teaches the 100th monkey late one evening. The 100th monkey finally gets it. Nothing else is happening. He goes to bed that night, getting ready to pack up. He gets up in the morning, and there's no monkeys around. And he walks down to the river, and there are all the monkeys just washing their potatoes. It's the story of the 100 monkeys. It's all about critical mass. You get to a critical point, and it just goes. It takes hold. So that's kind of a wonderful program over on the side. So on the basis, I want to tell you something, on the basis of my experience, this may not be your experience, but I want to make just a couple of comments on the basis of my experience, what seems to be critical. In terms of this work and moving forward, well, one of the problems with presenting like this is I end up telling you like my stories. They're not the best stories. It's just that the only stories I know, right? Like I'm sure you all have better stories, but those are the ones I know. And then you come into a community like this, and I don't know, like every community got its own rules. So Cape Breton has rules, right? But the only way, you gotta almost live there forever before you know the rules, right? Like you should know this, in case you ever come, here's a rule. Like if you're driving a car in Cape Breton and you come up to a stop sign, like everywhere, I'm sure in BC, you come to the stop sign, and you stop, and you wait till there's a break in the traffic, and then you go. In Cape Breton, that's not the way it works. We have our own rule about that. You come up to the stop sign, and rather than necessarily wait for a break, you wait until you think you've waited long enough. And then you go. And then if somebody's kind of, you move up in front of somebody, that they kind of say to themselves, oh, he must have waited long enough. I was in Toronto, we were in Toronto a couple of months ago at meetings, and it was the winter time, and I had a coat and hat on, and we're walking like through those underground malls. You know, they have in Toronto go on and on and on and on. And anyway, we're walking along, and it was late in the afternoon, and so it's quite hot, so I took my hat off, I'm holding it, and I'm going through a set of doors. So I sense there's somebody coming behind me, so I just hold the door. 7 minutes later, the last of them went through. And I looked down in my hat, and I had $5.65. See, they have different rules there. So I don't know what the rules are. But let me tell you just a couple of things that I've come to believe about the nature of this work on the basis of my experience. Number one, Cape Breton's fundamental challenge doesn't have anything to do with jobs. Directly, indirectly, sure, but not directly. Cape Breton's fundamental problem is the story it's living inside. And the story it's living inside, for a lot of good reasons, is a story about dependency, it's a story about powerlessness, it's a story about poverty, and it's a story about uncertainty. So the work is to move as a community, to move to another story. The greatest tales are the old tales. So the Bible or the Gita, they're full of wonderful, wonderful stories that are quite applicable to our lives. The story of Exodus in the Old Testament, which is the story about Moses moving the Jewish people out of Egypt, out of slavery. Slavery figuratively means the dark place. Egypt means the dark place. That was about changing. Moses didn't know what he was taking the people to. He just knew what he needed to take the people from. Sometimes it's not clear at first where we're going to, but we're usually clear about what we want to move from. The second thing that's incredibly important to me, which is my belief, is the work. The work is building capacity. The problem that struggling communities have is a problem of capacity. You go into a third world community, that community has no capacity. And how that manifests itself, usually capacity in the modern world finds expression by way of organizations. In a poor third world community, the most complex organizational form you will find is the family. Come into Cape Breton, we do have organizations, we're not a third world, but we don't have as many organizations as we should relative to the size of the community, and most of those organizations are busy serving some of their headquarters, not busy serving the community. Member 2 serves the community. New Dawn serves the community. They're exceptional in that respect. So the work is building an organization. Go into the grand city of Vancouver. One of the characteristics of a city like Vancouver, Vancouver is a modern city, it is a city of organizations. It's a city of incredible capacity.
The world is complex. The modern world is complex. You need the complexity of an organization to focus on any task. New Dawn is in the business of building capacity. That's the business it's in. And while relative to the problem, New Dawn's capacity may be very modest, we have more capacity this year than we did last year, and we'll have more capacity next year than we do now. That's our work. The third thing that I believe is this work is about the long game. We're not done by Friday. This doesn't happen quick. There are no transformations. I'm sorry. This is a grind. This is a grind. This work is the work of hope. Now you got to understand, hope is about the long game. The Protestant theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, he wrote the Serenity Prayer. What he said about hope was, nothing of value can be completed in one lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. New Dawn is well into its second generation. Those that were part of the first generation always understood that they would never see the end of this. If my time in this work were to be marked in seasons, and if I started in the spring, I am now in deep winter. I am in deep winter. I will not see the end of this. And that's as it should be, because we are in the long game, and we are about hope. We're also about faith. What I mean by faith is that, see, here's the problem. You know, in the modern world, we're always doing strategic plans. We do them all the time. I'll do more. But don't tell anybody this. But I don't believe in them. I don't believe in them. Here's the thing. You don't know where you're going. You don't know. It's like you're standing in a place, and before you is a thicket. It's a thicket of opportunity and challenge. You can't see the road ahead. You can't even see clearly where you're standing because you're surrounded by fog. That's just the way it is. The only thing you got going for you is you can turn around and you can see the road you've traveled. And on that basis, you take a probe. Try another step. Try here. People come to New Dawn and they'll say, we'll kind of outline what happened, and they'll say, how did you figure this all out? Like, how did you know to go there? Try and say this softly. Say it nonetheless. To be honest, like we said, we didn't have a clue, right? It's just one step after another. That same theologian said, it's impossible to understand the context of any particular moment. You don't understand it. You got to be saved by faith. That's going to work out. You got to be saved by faith that the Bumfords are going to answer the phone. That's the deal. Let me talk about trust for a minute. When I came into this work, I didn't start as a staff. I started as, first on a committee, and then I got on the board, and then I became the chairman of the board. So I was the second chair
this iconic fellow by the name of Greg MacLeod. Some of you know Greg, some of you maybe have heard of him. He was the chair, he's the first chair, he's the founder. So Greg, so I've been in this chair. I was very young. I didn't have much understanding of what I was getting into. The others on the board at the time were wiser than I, and they all declined, so I got it by default. So I remember my first board meeting, I chaired it, and I was quite nervous, and I got through it. And everybody, a couple of issues, a couple of motions. I get home that night, the phone rang. And there was one of the board members. They said, look, Rankin, I didn't want to say anything at the meeting, but I didn't feel good about that motion. I'm really not supporting it, really. Like, I went along with it, but I'm against it. So they'd tell me with that, and I'd listen to them, and they'd say, yeah, well, I'm going to leave that with you. I feel better now that I've talked to you. Good for you. So anyway, I finished that call and wondering what the hell am I going to do next. Phone rang again. Another board member. Rang. Look, I'm not comfortable with the way things went tonight. I think that was the wrong decision you made. Go on, but why? Anyway, I didn't want to say a word. I didn't want to offend anybody, but I'm going to leave that with you. I feel better now that I've talked to you. Sort of like I'm in the therapy business or something. 3 calls. 3 calls that night. I was really glad they all felt better. I go to bed, I'm awake all night wondering, what do now? That was the beginning of an incredible fascination I have with groups and boards, and how they work and how they don't. After the Second World War, there was a study at a place in England called the Haverstock Institute, and they wanted to understand groups and how they worked. So here's what they discovered: you put a group together, you give them a task. The group will do everything in its power to avoid completing the task. Without fail. It's like a law. That's what they do. What that means is, the only way a group will work together is when everybody trusts one another. When a group doesn't trust one another, they really don't do any work. They just sort of pass the time with one another. Pretend that they're taking it seriously. But in their heart, they're not prepared to commit. So one of the things we do with this is like a religious practice within the dawn. You come on the board, you got to agree to go on a weekend. You got to go on a weekend planning session. And we go far enough away that you can't get out. And that, it's not planning. We call it planning, it's not really planning. Although we'll kind of talk about this issue, where we're going and all that, but what's really happening is we're getting to know one another. Trust is about knowing. Knowing depends on time. You need time. We're not mechanical. We're human. You got to invest the time. What's very interesting, new board members, they come to that retreat. By the end of the weekend, they've made up their mind that they're either staying or they're leaving. They're going to run for their lives. We talk just a couple more things. Leadership. Go back to Exodus. One of the interesting pieces the story about Exodus is that when God said to Moses, "You're going to take the Jewish people and lead them to the Promised Land," Moses said he couldn't do it. He stuttered. He couldn't speak. Now that's a very interesting piece of that story. Why would God pick Moses, who couldn't speak? Well, the reason he did that was to make a point. The point is, all leaders are flawed. We are flawed. And there's always a way around the flaw. So God said to Moses, get your brother Aaron to do the talking. You do the leading, Aaron does the talking. Time and time again, when I go to somebody and ask them, "Would you do this?" "Oh God, I couldn't do that." Like we just don't feel confident that we can lead. And we're in the business of recruiting leaders. That's what this is. But you gotta understand that we're flawed. We all feel flawed. We feel flawed. So the notion of leadership is always, for many of us, maybe not for everybody, that's a bit of an issue. It's incredibly important to deal with that in a way that's caring, but at the same time, that doesn't get caught in everybody's reluctance to step up, because this work is a call to leadership, and we need more. This work is about forgiveness. You know that African proverb, if you want to go far, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. Our plan is to go far. We have to go together. That's hard. That's hard. Because we're making mistakes. Everybody around us is making mistakes. And we gotta learn to forgive. I was telling some folks here the other day, I was at this marvelous meeting in a place called Inverness, on the west side of the island. And a month or so ago. And there was this incredibly, one of the sessions, there was this elder spoke. And she told the story of her experience in residential schools, or one particular school. And she was placed in the school when she was 3, with her brothers and sisters, and they were separated in the school. And it was a horrendous story, incredibly touching, and one of the pieces of the story was her father would send her a doll from time to time, but they would take the doll from her. And she never knew what they did with it. Years later, she found out that they kept giving the doll to the caretaker, who had 12 girls at home. So when she finishes, somebody said to her, "Well, are you very angry?" She says, "No. I've forgiven everybody. They didn't know, they didn't understand what they were doing." Except she said, "I've forgiven everybody except that caretaker took my dolls. I'm still working on that one." I thought it was an incredible sign of leadership, her capacity to forgive what had happened. One of the most incredible stories I ever came across was a story that about Nelson Mandela when he was in prison, when he was first taken to prison, everybody was expecting. He had quite a following, so all the other prisoners were quite excited. He was coming, their leader was coming, and he was a relatively young man, quite powerful. The warden understands, or is of a mind, that Mandela is going to be trouble, so he's got to deal with him. He's got to deal with him. He's got to put him in his place. Mandela lands in the prison, and what he does, he takes Mandela to the courtyard, and he makes Mandela dig a grave. So in the heat of the day, Mandela's digging this grave, and all the prisoners are outside. They bring them all out to watch him dig in the grave. He finishes digging the grave, 6 feet down, long enough and wide enough to hold him, and then the warden tells Mandela to get in. Mandela figures they're going to bury him alive. And then the guards line up and they urinate on him. There's hundreds and hundreds of guards. And when that's all done, they leave him lying. And then late that night, they take him out. And the warden thinks to himself, okay, buddy, who's in charge here now? When Mandela, after he became president, and there was a grand reception taking place, one of many, but this one was special, and they're preparing it, and they go to Mandela, and they say, is there anyone in particular that you would like to have there, Mr. President? And he says, the prison guard, the prison warden. And he sees the warden coming in. The warden comes, sees him coming in, and Mandela goes over to him, embraces him, and thanks him for coming. Now that's forgiveness. We've got to learn about forgiveness. I want to leave you with a question. And it goes like this. And I have a kind of a general response to it, and maybe you do too. Let me kind of try and set the question up. Over the years, the institution that dominates a culture also tends to dominate the skyline. So if you go back 500 years ago, for instance, and you go to any community in Canada, what dominated the skyline? Church steeples. The institution of the church dominated the culture. It had dominated for 2,000 years. Go back 50 years ago. So that when I was growing up in Sydney, the tallest buildings were the government buildings. First time in Ottawa, government buildings kind of dominated everything. I remember my first time in Toronto, City Hall was huge in relation to most other things. It's a long time ago. The public sector dominated the skyline, and the public sector dominated the culture. In our times, what dominates the skyline? The private sector. Go into any city, big, tall, private sector institutions. What's interesting is it'll change. It's going to change. What comes next? I'm not sure exactly, but I think it has something to do conditions you're trying to create, your primary. One of the last thing I want to tell you that has been incredibly important to me. Certainly it's changed a bit now with all the electronic things we have going for us, but certainly in the early years, New Dawn was very much alone. And the problem with this work is quite intuitive. Like, it makes sense, this work we're doing, but in many ways it's still countercultural. Like, when we talk about, community capital, it's countercultural, it's still countercultural. That's what makes it hard, because we're swimming upstream. So the only way we survived, the only way New Dawn survived, was to try and keep maintaining connections with others in Canada, and to some extent in the States, who were doing this work. We desperately needed that connection. So, I've known about some of what you do here at BC for a long time. I've had occasion to experience it, and other places in Canada as well. But when I am with you, when I am in the presence of people like you, who do this work, I do not have the words to explain to you my gratitude.